Colorado Metro District Abuse. This is a continuing series of videos on various aspects of metro districts in Colorado, and today I'd like to talk about service plans. If you've heard anything about metro districts, you've heard about the service plan. Some say it's the constitution for the metro district. No, it's not. It's more like a charter. It is given by another government. The city or the county takes the application for a service plan, approves the service plan, and that then creates the government. So the city and the county are creating the government. It's not a constitution where the people are voting in a constitutional convention to create a government. But at any rate, I'm going to walk through a sample which is typical in most respects of all the service plans in the 2,000 plus metro districts in Colorado. Keep in mind there are a couple of concepts or principles that govern service plans. The service plan technically does two things. It creates a territory. What are the boundaries of this area that is going to be governed? And secondly, it defines the purpose of the metro district. Is it a library? Is it a water and sanitation district? Is it a district to provide high-speed rail? Or, in the case of metro districts, is it a district to build homes or businesses in a community and provide a way to pay for the infrastructure? And that's what metro districts do. That's their purpose. And so you create a territory. What are the boundaries? And the purpose is to build infrastructure inside that boundary. The streets, the roads, the pipes for water and sewer, etc. Now, when the service plan is approved and the district is created, the service plan also talks about how to govern. How are the decisions going to be made for the taxing and spending within the district? Taxing and spending your money as residents. So let's dive into it. I'm just going to walk through this sample agreement. There'll be a little overlaps and redundancies, but of course feel free to pause or accelerate through this tape as it helps you. Now, one point, this is going to be a proposed service plan in Westminster. At the end of this tape, I'm going to talk about a policy and procedures ordinance that was adopted by Westminster that addresses metro districts in particular, and is very, what I will call, resident friendly in managing special district service plan applications. It won't apply to the vast majority of metro districts because the vast majority of the cities and counties in Colorado haven't adopted a similar policy. They should. It's a model. It's really a very progressive and thoughtful and fair policy statement regarding metro districts and service plans. We'll get to that toward the end. Okay, let's look at the service plan and start at the beginning. This is the Consolidated Service Plan for Uplands Metropolitan Districts number 1 and number 2. You'll see it's prepared by the McGeady Beecher law firm. They are one of the large law firms that do metro districts for developers throughout Colorado. My guess is they have somewhere between 200 to 400 clients, and they are one of the ones who are most creative one of the law firms that are most creative in managing and I'll say manipulating the statutes in favor of, on behalf of their clients, the developers. In another development, not this one, Aurora Highlands, they essentially created a substitute governing board for the districts and gave the developer 7 votes on that board and the residents only 1 for each district. The goal, of course, was to make sure the developer always controlled the boards, which they did by manipulating the statutes. It violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, but that's another issue. At any rate, you'll see some of their creative work in this service plan as well. So we start at the beginning, and right off the bat, there is an issue. In the introduction, they explain that they're creating a metro district, and that metro district is independent of the city. And the city can only review what the metro district is doing to the extent there is a material deviation from the plan. Well, that's not exactly true, as we'll see here in a minute. The statutes indicate that the city that creates the metro district can impose whatever requirements they want in the service plan. They don't have to accept the service plan that is prepared by the developer. Most cities do, unfortunately, but they don't have to, and they can write into the service plan more supervision, more requirements, and in fact, they can adopt the service plan, create the district conditionally until the residents arrive and take over. So the city really has much more to say about all of this than the developer states in the opening paragraph of the service plan. But that's consistent with their effort to control the financing and the governance of the districts by setting a tone saying, once you create this, it's hands off. You can't tell us what to do. And that's simply not true. Okay, so one of the first things that the developer has to prove to the city is that there is a need, there's an economic need for this district. And in every single service plan I've seen, I've lost count, it's probably close to 100 or more. In every service plan I see, the developer explains that the city has to pass this, has to adopt the service plan and create a metro district because there isn't one there already. Well, that doesn't begin to explain why there's a need for it. Now, you'll see at the end, the Westminster does require a little bit more, again, which is unusual, but it's more consistent with the statute. And they pay lip service to it here at the end of the paragraph and say, the formation of the districts will be the most economic way to pay for the public improvements. Well, really the only way to prove that or to demonstrate that is to show that it's more economical to pay for the infrastructure through 2 loans, 2 sets of interest, and interest on interest, which is metro district financing, that is more economical than simply paying for it in the cost of the lot and including that in the cost of the mortgage, which is the traditional way and the way it's done in most other parts of the country. They pay lip service to it, but they don't prove, there is no data here to show that it's more economical. So again, that is a threshold requirement that should be enforced by the cities and counties. Unfortunately, it's not. But be sure, their initial statement and the one adopted in most cities and counties that it's enough simply to say that there isn't one there now does not begin to establish that it's the most economical way to do it. Okay, so then the service plan continues to explain that all the debt is going to be paid by taxes. Those taxes, of course, will be paid by the residents. And again, they pay lip service to the principle that these metro districts, quote, will insulate property owners from excessive tax and fee burdens and will result in a timely and reasonable discharge of the debt. Well, you'll see here in a minute that there's a significant question in these districts as to whether or not the property owners are exposed to excessive and tax and fee burdens. Again, if they're paying twice for the same costs of infrastructure, once in the cost of their lot, and then again through the metro district taxes, that's excessive. They're getting charged twice for the same cost. Continuing on, we get to the definition section for the service plan. In this case, the city code, it's important. They refer to the policy. This policy, again, is unusual, but it should be incorporated by reference into the document. And they should literally go through each element and indicate how they are complying with each element of that code, of that policy and procedures ordinance. They don't, they again pay lip service to it. Now, you're going to see this a couple of times. There's reference to cost verification. There's reference to an independent engineer, an independent accountant, and then later on, a external financial advisor. And what they're doing here is saying that city and any other legislators that may be interested, we are going to make sure that the residents are protected because we're going to have an independent engineer, an independent accountant, and an independent advisor certify that everything we are doing is correct, and we'll make sure that they are independent. Well, the problem is they're not. All of these individuals are hired by the developer, work for the developer, are paid by the developer, and simply take information that the developer gives them and repackages it with their imprimatur of quality, that everything they're saying and doing is correct. And we'll see an example of that here in a minute. But with respect to these definitions, you see, these folks will do what is reasonable. These folks will compare the data as part of their review. Developer-held bonds is defined here. What's really interesting is there's no reference in this document, again, to developer-held bonds. But what we find is that the bond that they're proposing in this case is going to be held by the developer, which has special qualities all its own. Developer Facilities Funding and Acquisition Agreement. This is an agreement that the developer enters into with himself, putting on the developer hat and then switching to the district hat and saying to himself, on behalf of the developer, I want to enter into an agreement with myself as the district to have the district promise to pay me, the developer, all the money that I advanced to them for costs. And that agreement sets up certain terms. In the one that we had, it included interest, I think, up to 18%. It essentially created a loan, the loan between the residents and the developer to pay all of the developer's debts. The residents aren't forgotten. They're called end users. They're the ones who are, quote, intended to become burdened, that's for sure, by the property taxes subject to the maximum debt levy and maximum term. We'll see those terms in a minute. Again, the external financial advisor, and you'll see here that they want to make sure that this external financial advisor is not an officer or employee of any district and has not been otherwise engaged to provide services in connection with or related to the applicable debt. And we'll see here again how that works. Inclusion area boundaries and inclusion area boundary map. This is one of the creative tactics that the McGeady law firm has employed in order to ensure developer control of the district for as long as possible. In the earlier generations of these agreements, and probably most of the agreements that are out there, they created a master-servant district. The master district in our community, for example, was about 10 square feet in size. No residents would ever live there. The developer would always own it and control it. For that 10 square feet of land, they had a board of 5 developer employees. And then they had the rest of the community broken into 2 districts, districts 2 and 3, and those were the taxing districts. Those districts were all resident, and they paid all of their money to District 1, 10 square feet owned by the developer, and District 1's board, all developer employees, would decide how that money was spent and how high the taxes had to be. Well, now they're doing something different. They have, instead of master-servant, they have created inclusion areas and the districts. So here's what that looks like. One of the attachments to the service plan identifies the district. This is, as you can see there at the top, this is District 1, and District 2 is identical with a similar sized piece of land, 2,000 square feet, and right next to this one. Here's a map of the development, and as best I could tell, because there was no real reference, geographical reference other than the degree descriptions, so as best I can tell, that's where these 2 parcels lie. All the rest of the district, all of the rest of the area is not in the district. This is the district right here. What they're doing now is they're calling the rest of this area of the development the future inclusion area. What that means is these people make all the decisions, and they will include the rest of the areas when they are ready, typically after the residents move in. And those district boundaries, once they include other areas, will expand, and eventually the entire community will be the district, and this will grow into this. So what's the point? Why go through all of this legal maneuvering in order to create a tiny district that will be controlled by the developer, leave everything outside, and as they want to, include the rest of the areas. It's all about control. As long as no one lives in the district, that tiny little piece of property, then no one has a say on what the board for those districts decide. It's not until they include everybody in the district can those folks participate, serve on the boards, and vote. We've mentioned these independent accountants, the independent engineer, and the independent advisor, and again, these are the external financial advisor, sorry. And again, these folks are actually hired, paid by the developer, work for the developer. And you can see the language here that creates a little smoke and mirrors. The independent accountant is retained by one of the districts that is not currently engaged by and has never been engaged by the developer. The district is the developer. So if they're retained by the district, they're retained and engaged and working for the developer. So they create this fiction that the districts are somehow different from the developer. They're not. The district is the developer. And that's true with respect to the independent engineer. In our community, after we recalled the board, we interviewed the so-called independent engineer for 2 hours, and he essentially explained that all he did was take what the developer gave him, repackage it into a glossy report, and call it good. He was never around when the infrastructure was built. He came in when they wanted to cash out and provide a basis for issuing the bond debt. Now let's look at an example of one of these financial experts in a document attached to the service plan, basically vouching for, this is really a good deal. They are going to be able to build this community and pay for it in a very fair manner and at no risk to the residents. This is Piper Sandler, and they're writing this to McGeady Beecher, and they're including it as an exhibit telling the city, please pass this service plan application because it's good and fair. Right off the bat, they explain that this analysis, quote unquote, summarizes and presents information on behalf of the developer. It does not include independently verifying information or assumptions. Well, there's your initial red flag. They're not doing anything independently. All they're doing is taking what the developer gave them, packaging it into a nice letter, and then you'll see at the very end covering their, pardon the phrase, but covering their rear end for any legal liability. They describe the development, the bond assumptions, which we'll see in the service plan here in a moment. And then they make some really interesting statements. First, on page 2, they say, the homeowners are only required to pay property taxes from the imposition of the mill levy. Yes, they're only obligated to pay taxes that are imposed by the developer board running districts 1 and 2. They go on to say that if there are any bonds issued, and there will be a bond issued to the developer in this case, do not create a lien on the property. Well, what they don't say is that if you don't pay your taxes, which pay the principal and interest on the bonds, if you don't pay the principal and interest on the bonds when you pay your property taxes, they will, through the county, impose a lien on your property and sell your home in order to recover those property taxes which pay the principal and interest on the bonds. So that is a creative way of not saying and not providing a comprehensive answer to the question. There is a significant risk to the individual homeowners that if this goes south and they're stuck paying bond debt that they can't afford to pay, they risk a lien being placed on their homes for the failure to pay the principal and interest on the bond through the property taxes. They go on to try to, my word, sugarcoat it by saying the primary source of the bond security for the bonds is the property taxes imposed by the districts dependent upon the assessed valuation. That's true, and the key part there is that if you don't pay your property taxes, there's a way to cash out the equity in your home in order to pay off the debt. And just to put a point on it, they say investors assume all the risk associated with the purchase of the bonds. If the development doesn't occur as projected, the investors assume the risk that the bonds won't be repaid or that payment may be delayed. And what they don't go on to say, and is equally true, is that if that happens, the investors can protect their investment by imposing liens on the homes and foreclosing on the homes to get payment on the bonds. If the taxes aren't paid, which pay the principal and interest, they can impose a lien through the county on the property. Then again, they continue to explain what they are doing and provide protection for any liability they may have. They say, based upon the development assumptions and the financial assumptions given to them by the developer, they think this will all work. But then they go on to say, these assumptions disclosed, or those of the developer, have not been independently verified by Piper Sandler. There's a high probability that forecasted results will differ from the future tax-based factors, and such variations can be material. In other words, there's a possibility this could all be wrong. We do not vouch for the achievability and disclaim any opinion of the information provided. The actual results may vary materially from the results presented here. We have no responsibility or obligation to update this information. I share this with you because it is an example of the independent accountants, the independent engineers, the independent external advisors relationship to the developer. This is one of those persons. And they know who's paying their bill. They know the purpose. They work for that person. And they're simply going to repackage whatever that person gives them and sell it to the residents, the city council, state legislature, whoever. The only way to really have independent accountants, engineers, financial advisors is for those persons to be hired, retained, paid for by the city or the county until the residents arrive. And when the residents get on the board, they can then hire and retain their own experts. But until then, until the residents take control of the boards, it's really up to the city to provide these independent evaluations. And the only way that can happen is if the city hires them or if they are city staff. These folks are not independent. They work for the developer. Going back to the service plan, the definitions of public improvements are all those public improvements that are going to be installed within the boundary of the district. Well, again, they manipulate the language here a little bit to say that we can basically do anything that is described in the Special District Act. That's not true. When they create a metro district, when the city creates a metro district, they're creating a limited government. When we create governments, we don't give them blank checks. We say, these are the things you can do. You can't do anything else. By writing this language into the service plan, they're saying, we can do anything the Special District Act says we could. We could, for example, build light rail service between our community and Winter Park. That's allowed under the Special District Act, but it's not allowed under the service plan. So this statement is inaccurate. It should not be included in a service plan. The service plan needs to say what the statute says, and that is that the service plan delineates what the metro district can do. It doesn't say you can do everything under the Special District Act except what we say you can't do. That's important. The government is limited to what the service plan says it is authorized, it is permitted to do. Okay, so the service area is the initial district boundary map and the inclusion area boundary map. Well, what they're saying is the service area for this district is going to be that little piece of property here, which is what the district will start out to be, and all the rest. The way this should be done is they should create one district. If they want to create a separate one for commercial, that makes sense, but there should only be one district for residential, one district, and it should be created, the boundaries of it should all be created at the same time. This inclusion and exclusion manipulation of the statute is only designed to ensure control by the developer and disenfranchise the residents. That is not a legitimate purpose for using that provision. Okay, we get into more substance. The initial boundary is that little piece I showed you on the map. The total for District 1 and 2 is 0.144 of an acre. The area outside, which will be later included, is almost 200 acres. So they won't include that 200 acres into the district until they get ready to, until they are willing to risk the residents having a vote. Until then, the developer will control what happens through that 0.144 acre district. Proposed services, again, they're giving themselves a blank check. The district shall have the power and authority to do whatever the Special District Act says it can do. No, the service plan limits the district to what it can do. Such improvements shall include but are not limited to. Yes, they are. They're limited to what's in the service plan. They don't get a blank check. Again, this is a misstatement of the statute and should not be embraced or approved by a city in the service plan. Covenant enforcement. This is a relatively recent development. As you may have read in the media, HOAs have come under more scrutiny, more regulation, more limitations through the state legislature, and so developers are avoiding that, sidestepping that new oversight and regulation by including enforcement of covenants within the metro districts, which they have much more control over than HOAs. Okay, now we're starting to get into the money side of things. The operations and maintenance of the district. You have basically two things that districts are paying for. They're paying for the debt to put the pipes in the ground, and then, secondly, they're paying for the operations and maintenance. You may have a rec center, a pool, landscaping, park areas, whatever it may be, and those have to be maintained and operated. This is saying that the district is not going to own or operate anything unless the city agrees to it. This financial advisor certificate says that whatever the financial advisor certifies is appropriate is enough to verify that the residents are getting what they paid for. Again, this advisor works for the developer, and you see the squishy language. That person is certifying that the interest rate that they are approving for the loan does not exceed a reasonable current interest rate. What does that mean? Very squishy, lots of discretion by somebody who's working for the developer. A developer who wants to make as much money as they can off of this deal as possible. With respect to the inclusion and exclusion, we've talked about how they start with the little piece of land and then they expand that by including the residents in as they develop those portions outside the district. And the district boundaries then change and include those larger areas. Well, there are a couple of things going on here that again are inconsistent with the statute and the policy statement from the city. It says the district shall have the right to change their boundaries by inclusions and exclusions. That's fine, but it's under the policy statement from the town, that's all subject to town review and town approval. They don't say that here. The overlap limitation. This is important again. It says the boundaries of the district shall not overlap unless the combined mill levies will not vary at any time or exceed the maximum debt mill levy. The statute doesn't allow that. It doesn't say that. In fact, the statute says you can't have overlapping boundaries for districts. You can only have one district in one territory. This is something new. It's something that they're using to, again, manipulate their ability to control the debt limit and how the debt is paid by the residents. There should be no overlapping. There should only be one district for the residents. They go on to say that the district shall not consent to the organization of any other district within the service area unless the combined mill levies will not exceed the maximum mill levy. There are reasons why there should not be overlapping districts or districts within districts other than whether a maximum debt mill levy is imposed. Again, this same law firm recently manipulated the statutes to give the developers 7 votes and the residents 1 vote on the board, which is simply unconstitutional. It violates the Equal Protection Clause, 1 person, 1 vote, and it sounds like they're steering in the same direction with this language. The statute does not permit it, and the service plan approved by a city certainly should not permit it. It doesn't matter whether the maximum debt mill levy is exceeded or not. The governance lines, the accountability between the residents and the board should not be manipulated through multiple districts. Okay, more detail on the debt. We get to what many will consider to be the most important part of the service plan, and that is what is the debt limit. Here they're saying they're not going to impose debt for more than $55.7 million. According to their financial plan, they're going to do that long before any residents arrive, within a year. And that debt will be imposed, it appears, on the residents to pay bond principal and interest to the developer. So it will essentially be a developer loan to the residents for to pay for their costs. What we don't know, and going back to one of the threshold requirements for the approval of a service plan, what we don't know is how much money did they pay for the land. We have an idea as to how much money it's going to cost to build out the infrastructure. How much are they going to charge the home builders, and then through the home builders, the residents? How much are they going to charge for the cost of the lot? What is the income stream there? In our community, we did a study and we found that after paying about $37 million for infrastructure, we paid another $75 million in profit even before they started the Metro District financing. We paid for it twice. So the question here has the developer already been paid for the cost of the infrastructure through the cost of the developed lot? Without that information, there really is no way to approve this service plan consistent with the requirement that they establish and prove that this is more economical than paying for the infrastructure through the cost of the mortgage. And we have an idea that things aren't quite as economical as they might be through one of the other attachments to the service plan. As part of the financial plan, we see the proposed debt schedule. They're going to issue bond, essentially to the developer, for $55,765,000. And as the repayment schedule is established, the residents are going to be paying $77,663,702 in interest. Virtually every bond I have seen, the interest is a little less than or equal to the amount of principal. Here, the interest is another $22 million higher than interest in normal financing arrangements. And that is even without addressing the question as to whether the infrastructure has already been paid. So on its face, this is not the most economical way to pay for the infrastructure, by paying $77 million in interest on a principal of $55 million. Again, keep in mind this debt limit of $55 million can change. The developer can, and I've seen it happen in many districts, go back to the city and say, we need more money. And so they get approval from the city to increase that limit. Developer reimbursement. Again, that's the whole point, right? Set up a mechanism to pay the developer back their costs. The traditional way is through the cost of the lot. The Metro District way is apparently the cost of the lot plus additional profit through the Metro District financing. They say again, the developer and the districts are going to enter into a special agreement, an IGA, where the residents essentially will promise to pay back the developer all of his costs. And they'll get a cost verification analysis from a, quote, independent engineer and accountant. Again, the only way those individuals will ever be independent is if they're hired by or employed by the city or county, or after the residents arrive, hired and retained by the residents. Here they estimate the cost of the infrastructure is going to be $60 million. Again, there's a way to verify that independently, but not through somebody paid for by the developer. The financial plan. Here they talk about issuing the bond debt, and they've already said they're going to issue that bond debt of $55 million within a year. They're saying the interest rate can be no more than 18%. That's not much of a limit. Then we get to one of the other important numbers. The first important number is how much money are they going to issue in bond debt. We know that, $55 million. The second number is what is going to be the limit on the amount of taxes. What is the mill debt levy limit? The statute says it should be no higher than 50%, but then there are immediately a whole list of loopholes that basically gut that as a limit. The Westminster policy statement and procedure ordinance indicate it should be no more than 25 mils. Here, they're imposing a limit, quote unquote, of 40 mils, which is higher than the city limit. And they go on to say that that limit only applies if the debt is greater than 50% of the assessed value. Well, this leaves unanswered, how do you calculate that assessed value? Is it the projected assessed value after build out, or what the assessed value is right now, which is 0? And it probably won't be much more than 0 the first year. So that's an issue. It's subject to interpretation, and the language here provides plenty of room for the developer's attorney to be creative in assessing or setting that mill debt levy. The cleanest way to do this is to simply say, as the Westminster policy statement says, the mill rate shall be no higher than X. In Westminster's case, they say 25. I've seen another community limit it to 35. It should just be set, no wiggle room with whether or not the debt limit applies depending upon the amount of assessed value compared to the amount of debt. Because what they're essentially doing is creating an opportunity, a loophole, to eliminate the debt levy. And I've seen that in other districts. In some districts, there is essentially no debt limit mill levy cap. There is no cap. And there is no cap under this agreement, depending upon how you interpret whether or not the assessed value is the projected or the current and compared to the amount of debt. There is a way to argue through this language that there is no cap on the amount of debt, mill levy debt they can impose. They go on to say that there's another limit. No bond, no debt can require payment for more than 40 years. After 40 years, it extinguishes. There's no more debt. Unless a majority of the board are residents and they voted to refund all or part of the debt. Refund is bond language for refinance. Typically in the districts, once the residents get charge of the boards, they realize for the first time how much debt they're in, how high the interest rate is that they're paying, and the first thing they want to do is refinance it to a lower interest rate. And the developer attorneys, who typically are still representing the board members, even as residents at that time, are more than happy to accommodate them for a fee and get the bond refinanced to a lower term. What that does, of course, is extend the amount of time that the debt will be paid. And in some districts, they keep refinancing and refinancing, and the debt is never repaid. It's perpetual debt. Modification of the service plan. The Westminster policy statement is very clear. The city is going to maintain oversight on these districts, and they don't want to see any changes unless they're approved by the city. So this service plan pays lip service to that the city will determine whether a change constitutes a material modification of the service plan. And then the very next sentence, They say, no, we're going to decide that. Any significant change will be submitted to the city. Who decides whether it's a significant change? The developer. So they, again, give lip service to the requirement, but say, we will decide initially if it's a significant change, and then of any significant changes, the city can decide whether it's a material change. That's not what the policy statement says. Again, a clever way to sidestep the policy statement, a clever way to build into the plan their right to make changes, and if it's not a significant change in their opinion, the city will never know about it unless somebody complains. Okay, we mentioned two revenue streams, one for the debt, paying the debt, another is to pay the operations and maintenance. Well, there's a separate tax limit for debt. Here they're saying 40 mils. And there's a separate limit for taxing to pay operations and maintenance. And here what they're saying is there will be no limit. It can go up to however many mils as you want. They start at 10, but the maximum levy will not apply to operations and maintenance. Disclosure and transparency. There's been a lot of attention paid to what do you tell the homeowners about metro districts. When I first shared some of this information with the state legislature and said, you know, there's a lot here that they're not telling the homeowners. And I gave her some examples, and she was aghast and astonished, and at the same time said, well, you can't tell the homeowners that. They'd never buy a home there. Of course, that's the point. It's the homeowner's decision to decide whether or not they want to enter into this financial arrangement. And it's simply unfair not to tell them what the financial arrangement is when they're making that decision. So, again, the service plan pays lip service to the principle of giving information to the purchasers, but as you can see in this language, they hedge it, and it becomes, in essence, a non-disclosure. The district shall use reasonable efforts and due diligence to cause any home builder or developer to provide all purchasers of property with the information. So they're saying, we'll do everything we can to persuade the home builder or the developer of the residential property to give the homeowners information. No. The disclosures are controlled by the developer. They control the boards. They have the emails for the residents. They post information on the website. They send mailers to the residents. They have direct access to and control the flow of information to the residents. They should and must be required to convey information that the city determines meets the test of what's reasonable and informative for the residents. They suggest a video to all home builders and try to encourage the home builders to share it with potential purchasers. I've seen their videos. They are basically sales or marketing pitches for how wonderful metro districts are. They don't share with the residents important information such as the residents have a right to serve on the boards as soon as they buy a house. the information does not disclose the exorbitant debt authority hanging over their heads. So what's provided in these disclosures should be required by the city, not defined by the developers. Again, they're saying they will make efforts to have the sales offices provide this information, reasonable efforts, due diligence. No, they're just sidestepping the accountability, sidestepping the responsibility. The developer, as the controlling board on the districts, should provide this information to the potential homeowners. And it should be provided at the initial contact, at the time the initial contract is signed, at the time disclosures are required for the property, and of course at the time of the closing. They talk about a website. The websites are required by law now. This is not something they're doing because they want to do the right thing. They're now required. But again, they don't say what they're going to put in it. They'll just say it shouldn't contain marketing materials. Well, it does contain marketing materials to the extent they're selling the residents on how wonderful metro districts are. But again, what's on those websites should be prescribed by the city and county and controlled by them. Meeting locations within a 5-mile radius of the districts. Again, meeting locations once the residents purchase property there must be within the district and online so that residents can easily attend. Many districts schedule their meetings in the middle of the workday. Again, it should be at times and locations when the residents can participate. Those are the key points of the service plan that I wanted to share with you. There is one more section here, the annual report. We'll talk about a little bit more with respect to what's going on in Westminster, but the long and the short of it is that the state legislation gives the city and the county the opportunity to require information from the metro district to the city or county of any kind at any time during the time the metro district is in existence. They're not limited to annual reports. They're not limited to 5-year reports. The city, if they write it into the service plan, can require reports at any time of any kind of information. And the cities and counties should do that. They are not limited to annual reports. The Westminster policy statement does that and is very clear that they are going to maintain some measure of oversight and supervision, particularly until the residents arrive. Now, one of the agreements that are referenced in the service plan is the agreement between the city and the district. Those agreements, intergovernmental agreements, IGAs, basically repeat the key elements of the service plan and put it in the form of a contract between the city and the metro district. They aren't terribly significant. They simply, in most instances, repeat what is contained in the service plan. However, I thought I would share with you one example of a provision that is relatively new and prompted by the change in the legislation, and that is they talk about community engagement. And again, they're paying lip service to, we want the residents to know as much about these districts and give them an opportunity to get involved as soon as possible? Well, they're simply complying with statute that require the creation of a public website, and continue and allow or provide that notification to the residents will be through the website, and if they have the emails for the residents, through the email. We'll see how that works in practice, but the long and the short of it is, in the past, the developers have used fence posts in the middle of fields and made no real genuine effort to communicate important information to the residents. This is beginning to change, but it will require enforcement by the city to make it work. They give themselves an out. If it's an inactive district, they don't have to do these things. Well, there are inactive districts and there are inactive districts. The question is, what does that mean and how will it be enforced? Again, we'll see how this develops. But until the residents get control of the boards, there has to be a diligent effort by the city and the counties to make sure that the communications are open, candid, and the residents have as much information as possible in order to make decisions. We talked about the statutory requirements, and here's just a sample of the statutes that talk about how the city and the county should handle applications to create metro districts. And what's interesting, and is rarely shared, and certainly not shared by the developer during their application, is that the statutes put all the burden on the developer. In talking to many city and county legislators, they have explained that they always thought that the developer had a right to a metro district, just like they have a right to develop their land. Well, that's simply not true. The reverse is actually the case. They don't have a right. The county and the city shall disapprove, shall deny a service plan unless the developer proves all of these things. And the burden is on the developer to prove these things. And if they can't prove each and every one of these with evidence, verifiable evidence, it must be denied. So, one of the key elements is there is an existing and projected need that this district will provide economical and sufficient service, that there will be a financial ability to discharge the indebtedness. One of the first things they need to establish, one of the first things the developer needs to establish is the residents aren't already paying for the infrastructure through the cost of the developed lot. If the residents are already paying it and the developer's making a profit on that, there's no need for Metro District. Here are other opportunities for the city and the counties to be involved. There must be public hearings. Material changes must be approved. The city can define what those are, not the developer. Annual reports, and in fact, the way this is written, they can require reports at any time, and they're not limited to annual reports. They may require information of any kind, and as detailed as they want. And in addition to that, as I said before, these applications may be conditionally approved. And the condition could be until the residents have control of the boards, which makes sense. If it's conditionally approved until the residents arrive, then the city and the county, or the city or the county, whoever creating it, will have the ability, will have the obligation to provide oversight, checks and balances, the same kind of accountability that residents would have and require, but can't because they're not there. And it's critically important in these cases because you have a developer who's making arrangements to get paid a lot of money from people who aren't there yet, and they're making all the rules and conditions, setting all the agreements, the interest rates, the amount of principal, and there's no check and balance. Nobody is reviewing this. If the city does that review, if the city provides the checks and balances, then there is at least the opportunity for traditional government accountability, oversight by the residents. Okay, let's talk briefly about the policy statement that Westminster adopted in 2004. This is an unusual ordinance, unusual because there aren't many cities that have done anything like this. But for whatever reason, they figured it out and made specific, passed specific requirements for approving service plans that reflect a genuine concern for the residents' financial interests. So, a couple of highlights here. They want to prevent the shifting of development risk to non-developers. And I'll say here, I attended a ULI conference or symposium in Denver several years ago. And one of the presenters was an influential spokesperson for the financial community with respect to metro districts. And he explained, he said, one of the reasons they created metro districts through the legislature in 1982 was to shift the risk of development, the risk of loss, away from the poor developers to the residents. And that's what they've done. They shift the development risk to the non-developers. And that may be a good thing for the developers. They are guaranteed their payment long before the end of the project. They get their money, and there is a large bill for the residents. And if things don't work out well, the residents are left literally holding the bag and assuming all the risk. They risk losing their homes to foreclosure if the interest and principal on those bonds are not paid. So this ordinance tries to avoid that problem. And one of the things they do is impose a mill cap of 25, not 40, 25. And this will cover debt service and operating expenses. The service plan we just looked at said 40 mils for debt, another 10 mils at least for operations and maintenance for a total of 50 mils. This says 25 mils for both. This page contains a list of protections, reference to protections for the residents. And it states in the very beginning that the city is opposed to creating metro districts in residential developments, and it gives reasons. Longmont, City of Longmont does the same thing. They actually voted to prohibit metro districts in residential communities. In Westminster, they noted that all existing residential development had been done without metro districts. So there's no evidence that there is a need for districts in order to pay for residential development. They've been doing it all along without any problem. They're concerned that residential districts create a property tax differential. That is to say, residents in metro districts are paying significantly more in property taxes than residents who don't live in metro districts. And that's not a good thing. Why is that? They note, which is very insightful, that residents who are paying a lot of metro district taxes to pay developer debt aren't going to be too excited about paying higher taxes, even though those taxes may be for schools, roads, dams, water, whatever it may be, police, fire, that are genuine public services that are traditionally funded by taxes. If you're paying a lot for developer tax, you're not going to be excited about paying more taxes for other things. Residents are generally unaware of the whys and wherefores for these higher taxes, and doing little videos and trying to persuade home builders and sales agents to do a better job in disclosing the hard truths about metro districts isn't going to be enough to educate homeowners as to what's going on. Again, disclosure required by the city must be distributed, and proof of that distribution provided to the city. They say there might be a benefit if home prices were lower in metro districts, meaning people pay less for the houses. You pay $30,000, $40,000, $100,000 less for the house, whatever you're going to pay in taxes for the infrastructure, you pay that amount less in the cost of the home. There might be a benefit. Studies have shown that that is not the case. You are still paying market price for the cost of the developed lot, which generates profit to the developer as well as reimbursement for the cost of the infrastructure. There is no basis then for metro district financing. In summary, there is generally not a compelling public purpose and benefit to form residential districts. In very limited and unique circumstances, the city may support such a district. And they give examples here which may or may not be satisfied by this particular application. Again, The city is more concerned about residential districts due to the differentials in the expertise of the buyers. That is, the residences know little or nothing, residents know little or nothing about metro districts when they're first buying their homes, whereas commercial property owners have more access to information and, of course, access to attorneys and accountants to advise them. Again, there has to be a special reason for doing a metro district in a residential application. The city wants residential buyers to be aware of the additional tax burden. And contrary to that very first statement in the service plan, the city maintains the expectation that the district will work with the city on any new or strengthened constraints to be imposed beyond the original ones contained in the service plan. The city is going to continue to be involved in the manner and to the extent provided in this chapter. The city council shall maintain continuing jurisdiction over the operations and affairs of the district after approval of the service plan and or the amendments. One of the documents that is not included in this application and is required are the district election questions. This is critical. In a prior video, I explained that in this election, the initial election, the developer does two things. Sets an astronomical authority for debt. In this district, it will probably be something close to $5 billion, but we don't know because they haven't included it. The second thing they do is eliminate the right of residents to vote on bond debt and tax debt. They take away that right, which is guaranteed in the Colorado Constitution, known as TABOR. They take away that right from the residents. That should be prohibited. No city, well, let me step back. Every city should require that they will approve these election questions before they're submitted to the voters. And the voters, again, are the developer, his family, and employees. No residents, because there aren't any residents yet. So the developer is voting on these things, but obligating the residents when they vote. So no city, there's no one there to protect the residents' interests. The city is the only one that can do that. They should prohibit the developer from voting to eliminate the right of the future residents to vote on bond debt and tax debt. The resident should always have the right, should always be required to vote on approving bonds or tax debt that they will have to pay. And that intergovernmental agreement between the districts where District 2 and 1 agree to pay all of the debts of the developer should be reviewed and approved by the city. It was not attached to the application. So, covered a lot of material. This is a long video. I hope that you will pause it and take whatever time you need to absorb some of it. But the service plans are the one of the backbones of metro districts. And unfortunately, until recently, but still the case in most instances, the cities and the counties just rubber stamp these. Some legislators still think that the developers have a right to these. They don't. And that the city and the county just really don't have much to say or much control over it. Or they don't want to have much say or control over it. It's too hard. It takes resources. It's a responsibility to act on behalf of future residents to protect their interests. But if they don't do it, the residents will be, just as many of them currently are, significantly abused, financially compromised, financially threatened by the oppressive maneuvers by developers to control the finances and the governances in order to do the thing that the developers are best at, making money, making profit. The developers are great and are very successful in building communities and making profits for their investors. They are terrible at governing. And you simply don't want, as someone who has represented developers in past career lives, you simply don't want to create a government by the developer, for the developer, of the developer, and subject residents to that governance and those obligations. The city and the county are the only ones that can provide those checks and balances until the residents arrive. They must step up, as Westminster has, in this policy and procedure ordinance, to more closely monitor, supervise, and provide the checks and balances for the developers' decisions on how to tax and spend future residents. Thank you very much. I encourage you to listen to the other videos. They provide some additional information, more specific information. But that's what I have to share about the service plans, and hope it's been helpful.